Okay, well, good morning and good afternoon to all those of you who have been with us in the previous sessions, and to those that are joining us today for the first time. Welcome. I'm very happy to welcome you all to the fourth session of Constellations of the Ordinary, this colloquium in memory and homage of Stanley Cavell's life and work. On each date in our colloquium, we have, by mere chance, found our speakers dealing with the same topic each time, from an ordinary language philosophy perspective and under the lens of Cavell's thinking. In February, Avner Bas and Byron Davies touched on the question of the world. In our second session, Toro Moy talked about philosophical criticism, which he called a Wittgensteinian phenomenology of criticism, and Stephen Affeld beautifully performed one such criticism in his reading of Stanley's autobiography, Little Did I Know. In our last session, Niklas Toivokainen, hailing from Finland, and Jonas Tekio from Brazil, both talked about the central Cavellian issue of skepticism. And today, again, synchronistically talking about the same topic, Juliette Floyd and Sandra Loger will be addressing our digital age from an ordinary language philosophical perspective. Juliette will use the Wittgensteinian notion of forms of life to suggest how we can understand this age of the apparatus, as she calls it, following Katz and Akkus, not from the traditional mechanistic and individualistic philosophical paradigm that has prevailed, but instead resorting to her own surprising reading of Turing, introducing an ordinary language philosophical paradigm that highlights instead the collaborative nature of human existence. And Sandra will apply to TV series Cavell's own approach to film, emphasizing their potential for moral education. So I'm both honored and delighted to introduce two more very special Cavellian friends, Juliette Floyd and Sandra Loger. As usual, we will listen to both speakers first and then open for questions. And we will start today with Juliette, who teaches at Boston University and is well known for her work on Wittgenstein's philosophy, especially his philosophy of mathematics. Since 2016, when she was awarded the Mellon Sawyer Seminar Grant, she has been pursuing research into the philosophy of emerging computational technologies, out of which come both her forthcoming book with Katz and Schiepers, Perceiving the Future Through New Communication Technologies, Robots, AI, and Everyday Life, as well as her presentation today. I leave with you then Juliette Floyd, who will be talking about her paper, Selves and Forms of Life in the Digital Age, a philosophical exploration of Apparatgeist. Juliette, welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Victor. Can everyone see? I'm afraid I'm using full screen, so I can't see anything except my own slides. Can people see this? Hello?
Can we see what?
Can you see my slide?
No.
Oh, I have to share screen first. I'm very sorry. You would think that I would remember that, but there we go. Okay, everyone, well, thank you so much for coming today, and thank you, Victor, for that lovely introduction, and Sandra for being here with me, which is a great honor. Okay, so I'm going to enter full screen. Oh, good, I can still see people this way. This is much better. All right, so I'm going to kind of reorganize the presentation, I guess. I won't follow the exact order of my paper because I want to integrate a little bit with what Sandra's going to talk about. So I'm first going to talk about what it means to talk about the importance of the social from a Cavellian or an ordinary language point of view, and it's more complicated than we might think. Then I'm going to say a word about this view of Apparatgeist that my collaborator, Jim Katz, who came to me about 6 years ago from the Division of Emerging Media, very much enamored of Wittgenstein. And it was really his idea to go interdisciplinary. So that's sort of what I'm beginning to do a little bit. I'll talk a little bit about TV series, in particular the concept of dating. And then I'll end with a remark about popular culture. I'm going to begin with that too, to get ready for Sandra. So I'll try to go on about 20 minutes. Please tell me, Victor, if I'm going over, because it's a little hard to measure things. Okay, so I'll begin with popular culture, Blade Runner 1982. This is the Turing test picture that the community of AI researchers and most philosophers of mind still hold on to, which is essentially a kind of Cartesian picture of the Turing test. The idea is, can you tell whether it's human or machine? And this is a sort of epistemological problematic because presumably we cannot know someone else's consciousness. And in particular, the movie focuses on emotional ties between human and machine. I'd like to note that there is absolutely no anticipation of social media and mobile technology in that film, despite the fact that it's very prescient about a lot of other technological things. Also, there are no institutions in the film except corporations, police, and urban street food. So there's no interaction really between the two and the institutions. That's not just action fighting. There are no apps. There's no localization of the use of machines for accomplishing purposive tasks. Instead, it's all human versus machine. And there's no imagined hybridization of human bodies and machines. So I find this very interesting that a movie that was in a way very prescient is still in the grip of what I regard as a misreading of Turing's test. So let me talk about that now, but hold on. I don't seem to be advancing. Why is that? Okay, I guess I have to do that. So the usual picture of this 1950s paper, and by the way, Turing used to giggle when he read it out loud. I mean, he thought that it was poking fun at philosophers. And the usual picture is, of course, that you have a human. Can you see my pointer? Yeah. You have a human behind a screen. The screen screens off a machine and a human. And the name of the game is to guess which of A and B is the human and which is the machine. So that's the usual thing. And it looks like an epistemological problem and a problem of ignorance. But actually, what the Turing test really was for Turing was an experiment in ordinary language, an experiment in the articulation of concepts. Because the fact is, after you play the Turing test, which is essentially a language game, you then need to embed that game in a form of life. I mean, you've got to get up from behind the screen and go and have a cup of coffee with the person who you just did the Turing test with. So this is how Turing, in fact, regarded this. And Turing was, I think, very seriously influenced by Wittgenstein. And Turing talked about it as an experiment in phraseology. So Jim Katz and his colleagues, who were sociologists of communication technologies, sort of pioneered the study of mobile technology when it started becoming ubiquitous in the early 2000s. And the real picture of the Turing test that you should have is a very dynamic one where people are ducking in and out with their machines and constantly talking with one another about the fact that they're doing that. And so this whole idea of sort of an outside perspective on identification collapses into this very dynamic mobile world that we now have. And Katz's empirical work as a sociologist was really incredibly predictive of a number of things that people talk about all the time now, but 13 years ago, we're not even registering. So an historical point first about Wittgenstein and Turing, and I'm going to not emphasize Stanley's work so much here. I'm going to take it for granted as something we've been talking about. But Stanley was really the first reader of Wittgenstein to see that the notion of form of life is absolutely central, and must we mean what we say is filled with this insight. Now, historically, I was amazed to learn only some years ago when I started looking at the archaeology of how Wittgenstein composed the philosophical investigation. The notions of form of life and technique, amazingly enough, only occur after 1936 in Wittgenstein's work. Most scholars would have thought technique was in there earlier in the middle period, but it's not. It never occurs. And in fact, it happens these come in at the same time that he's grappling with Turing's uncomputable numbers, the purpose of which is to show, in a sense, that there is no general algorithm for utilizing logic. There is not one. So Wittgenstein developed, on my reading, a response to this, sort of burrowing down into rethinking what's given in logic, what's given in a concept, what's given in philosophy, and what's given in language. And the earmarks of this in terms of his manuscripts is that first he breaks through, of course, to the mature interlocutory style of writing, which from his point of view is necessitated by the fact that logic is not gap-free. You have to give up that Phrygian ideal. He eliminates the notion of culture from the manuscript at exactly the same time. In the Blue and the Brown book, to imagine a language is to imagine a culture. But after he goes through this turn, it's to imagine a form of life. And incidentally, the notion of a Lebenswelt, the phenomenologist notion, never occurs in Wittgenstein's writings. That's got to be intentional. So forms of life is very different. A language game has to be sort of overcome or regarded as something to be embedded in a form of life. And Wittgenstein, in a sense, from my point of view, regresses down into a much more dynamic and interesting, if you like, foundation, but now it's not really foundationalism. What also comes in 37 is aspects, the notion of an aspect, which I know Avner is very interested in. Aspects of articulation and reality, that is to say, dimensions of experience, typologization, generality, the sense of depth and superficiality. These things are always discovered in Wittgenstein. If you look at his corpus, the aspects are discovered, whereas techniques are invented. Okay, and of course he's responding to the classic question in philosophy of math, is it discovered or invented? But he's generalizing his exploration of that distinction. And the notion of technique, you can see in the manuscripts, really starts playing a very central role as he begins to realize that a given sentence has to be associated with a variety of techniques, not just one technique. And in fact, in his discussions with Turing in his 1939 lectures, you will see the notion of technique is used 114 times. So in those lectures, he's debating with Turing the role of that notion of technique. And just as a side point, in Turing's philosophical writings, the notion of technique is very, very important. So the whole thing required a kind of reworking of the place, not only of logic, but of phraseology and voice in human experience of voice. And I want to say, in some sense, that ordinary language philosophy, the everyday, all these issues about skepticism and experience that Cavell emphasized are necessary. They're absolutely necessitated from a foundations of logic or foundations of math point of view. And I think that's what helped Wittgenstein get tipped toward his later style. Now, Turing, in the founding document of AI of 1948, Intelligent Machinery, it's a fascinating document. There's a lot of philosophy in there if you know where to look. And I don't mean the kind of philosophy that they're doing in the MIT Media Lab, where you build the moral machine that goes through millions of trolley problem responses. Okay, that's not what Turing thought you should do. Turing did not think we should build humans like robots. He thought that was a complete waste of time. Instead, he emphasizes the role of everyday language when we design and program. And he also emphasizes the importance of initiative, creativity, the dynamic evolution of human concepts. He considered intelligence itself an emotional concept. And essentially his idea about thought or intelligence, not a bad one to get out of the investigations, is that intelligence consists in understanding the different varieties of human searching, seeking, and finding. And he culminates the essay by talking about what he calls the cultural search, which he thinks will be the primary driver of creativity in our future interactions with one another in the presence of machines. And he calls it the cultural search. So that's how I read Turing. Now, this, of course, is intimately connected with many things in Stanley's work that we've already discussed in this seminar. First, the problem of skepticism concerning other minds in forms of everyday life. The fragility of embedding words in everyday life is more fundamental to lived experience than the question of how and whether the external world is represented. So this Cartesian starting point on experience, certainly in Wittgenstein and Austin, and also thematically in Stanley, this Cartesian starting point has to be overcome. And this, of course, echoes back to Thoreau and Emerson and a variety of things that I think Stanley shows us, certainly were involved in. They were achieving a different starting point. So now the field of experience becomes something very different. And it's a question of the ways we acknowledge others and are acknowledged by them in particular situations of everyday life. It's not a matter of epistemologically detecting humanity in general with criteria or top-down concepts. And Stanley emphasizes that forms of life have an ethological and biological dimensions. Turing also discussed what he called the biological search, as well as the intellectual search. Silence and privacy have a variety of meanings in everyday life. It's not a matter of information as the primary concept. And establishing speech acts in situations means embedding them in and thereby transforming forms of life. And here Stanley, again following Emerson and Thoreau, emphasizes the epidictic character of this embedding, the aspiration to moral improvement and perfection, as well as the demand for acknowledgement. Now, Katsanakis, whose work started being published around 2000, noted in their many investigations of what was happening and what people were doing with mobile technology when it entered. They emphasized the press toward universalization of form of life and toward the difficulties of individual expression. And they noted that this seems to be what's driving our uses of mobile technology, especially in social media. So I'm going to make a couple of remarks about sociology just because it helps me understand what it means to try to get into dialogue with sociology as a philosopher. And of course, philosophy of language, all these things around Turing are vastly, the analytic tradition has vastly under-articulated social philosophy for far too long. So thinking about this in the way Katsanakis would, the usual categories of social theory involve agency, structure, interaction, and change. But what Katz and his colleagues suggest is that these are now in dynamic interplay with one another within forms of life. So they're pretty explicit that they're developing this notion of the everyday, of course indebted to Bourdieu for the notion of a habitus, of course indebted to Bourdieu for the idea of distinction, social status being something we utilize mobile technology for. Also, of course, indebted to Goffman, Giddens, and Mazur for the whole idea of practical mastery of everyday activities as part of the social locus of what it is to have a self. However, they also had to deal as sociologists with the concept of structuration as it existed in the 80s. And here you have an idea of Giddens that structuration is social change and its interaction with institutions, rather than a certain kind of technological determinism. So it's not that we introduce mobile technology and now we get predictable results. Rather, the whole dynamism of technology and human voice is shifted. Now, in structuration theory, of course, space-time environments are pivotal. So where you bring your mobile phone, since we tend to bring these mobile phones with us everywhere, becomes very important. From Orlikowski, they get the duality, the anti-determinism about technology, and the idea of adaption from Poole and De Sanctis. Technology is adapted into the institutions, but also the domestic sphere as well. So we can't do sociology simply at this top-down level. However, they noted limitations of structuration theory when they started investigating the effects of mobile technology. Structuration theory puts people back in the picture, but it still tends to focus on particular domains like work, home, family. The mobile phone cuts across all of that. It's not helpful anymore to think about a human being according to those domain-specific things. They also overlook what Granovetter calls the strength of weak ties, and I know Sandra has published on this. Granovetter did a study of which groups in Boston were politically most successful politically in the early 70s. And what he found was that groups that affiliated with groups that were not ethnically or familially attached tended to be much more powerful. Of course, we're seeing that in spades with social media today, the power of weak ties. Structuration theory is also not very predictive because with this top-down approach, it sort of remains fixed in its understanding of individual institution sphere of life. So Katsanakis complained the content animating socio-technological environments is missed. The press toward individuality, explicit and implicit reasons that individuals act and structure their communicative lives in the way they do. So my paper is essentially pointing out that ordinary language philosophy is what you need in order to really begin to think about what this shift in sociology is doing. And I think Jim also regards this as an almost necessary philosophical move in light of what they did. So here's a remark. The mobile phone presents a radically different solution to the phenomenon of absent presence than traditional mass media and the internet as an information retrieval tool. The mobile telephone is a means to regulate one's social environment through integration of social contact, rather than simply inviting socially dispersing media into one's life. But technology does not determine what an individual can do. Rather, it serves as a means of transforming possibilities. So from their point of view, television is rather different from mobile technology. And we'll hear from Sandra about her views about that in a moment. But the fact that we carry it with us, that we use it to stay in touch with people from a variety of different parts of our life, this is very, very different from the medium of television. Now I'm going to say a word about dating because I don't want to go on too long. I really want to hear what you people have to say. But I'm getting interested in dating apps. I mean, I guess as soon as I drop out of the dating world myself, I'm fascinated, and I have a daughter who's 19. So of course this is very interesting. And I quote now from a book by Maura Weigel, Labor of Love, on the history of dating. Everyone agrees there's no agreement on this subject. To be adult today is to become responsible for determining the rules under which you will date. We must each spell out the terms of our own sexual and romantic encounters. Many people my age first learned how to online, right? So this is interesting. She's regarding dating as a kind of form of life arena in which embedding words and displaying yourself so that others can respond to you is part of what the art of dating involves. Next spring, I'm going to teach a seminar on Henry James and new media with Susan Mitsrucky, my colleague in the English department at BU. So I'm looking forward to, teaching Portrait of a Lady alongside dating apps. So dating is a work of labor in a time-pressed economy. Too many words about what it is to want what you want is both an obsession and a turnoff. The incredibly fine conventions that young people develop with SMS texts in social situations is really quite remarkable. They have conventions, but these evolve. Now, we're also attempting naturally to offload emotional labor onto mechanical devices like Alexa, of course, SMS texts, and emojis, elder care robots. But I do want to insist that it's human-to-human interaction in forms of life that really matters as the framing for all of this. And in a sense, this goes back to Turing, who would have regarded the computer as a human being, by the way, probably a woman working in an insurance company. That's what a computer was when he wrote his paper in the 30s. The point of the machines is to offload repetitive labor so that we can interface in more sophisticated ways. That at least is the picture that he has. Now, if we recall Stanley's ideas about Austin and his going beyond Austin with the idea of passionate utterance, of course, it's intrinsically unruly. And the idea that it could be mastered or ruled by understood conventions or protocols is a fantasy or myth. Certainly in the present day, when institutions of marriage and affiliation are rapidly changing, along with gender identity and all kinds of other things. So again, Stanley's idea, criteria do not ensure existence. They only animate a field of relevance, discussion, and criticism, which can go beyond the terms in which one inherits the conventions. And of course, I have to be interested in the reality show, The Bachelor, in order to really pursue this into the realm of popular culture. I never would have watched this show if my daughter had not been 14 and told me that she wanted to watch it so that she could talk to her friends at school about what was going on in the show. Of course, when I first saw it as a feminist, I was absolutely horrified. I thought this was the most retrograde thing I had seen in my life. But I listened and I watched, and I think I have learned by watching. A program like The Bachelor is filled with cliche, and it is very retrograde in some sense. And yet, In reality, forms of life in which marriage is still a remaining but transforming institution are played out here, clearly, pleasurably, repetitively. It's funny that The Bachelor always says the perfect thing. Okay, so they're educative. The viewers being shown, particularly the young woman, the young pre-adolescent, how specifically one may wish to speak, react, choose, display oneself, and compete in the course of romantic courtship. Forms of interaction are proposed, surveyed, and distilled into these forms. Melodrama is of the essence. And of course, Stanley's work on melodrama is extremely important for me in connection with this. I quote from his essay on Stella Dallas: "She learns not to appeal to the taste of those who have no taste for her." So Bachelor Nation, as it has now come to be called, millions of people watch this. Of course, the social media context of the reality show is very important. Social media followers tend to drive what the editors do in scripting the show. Of course, the whole idea of reality is quite attenuated here, or not attenuated, but if you like, sophisticated. But what I'd like to say about Bachelor Nation is it preserves the idea that there's something that it is to speak rightly. There are norms and patterns, but these must be inhabited one by each one of us with inventiveness. And what you're really watching is, oh my gosh, what are they going to say now? It conveys, if you like, the reality of relationship through words that are cobbled together in forms of life. So here, influenced by Stanley and by Sandra's writings, I would say this is not mass culture any more than mobile technology is mass media. Rather, it's a schematization of possible shapings of life with words, conversations, misacknowledgements and acknowledgements, ways of expressing specific care. And it's very important that The Bachelor, a show like The Bachelor, is very heavily scripted so that they urge the contestants, they put them in situations where they're likely to cry or express anger or emotion. And then what the writers do is to edit that thing to the point where it's not really real in a sense. Of course, it's more real than real. It's scripted and edited. And this, I think, is exacerbated, or if you like, made more intense by the large social media presence, where people affiliate with the characters, dislike certain characters, express themselves loudly about this. So Bachelor Nation affiliates, I would say, primarily women through melodrama. It's an imagined community grappling with passionate utterance. And it may do this in ways that we can feel are, not great art, okay, and not great necessarily inventiveness. But nevertheless, there's something that should explain what people are getting, the millions of people who watch this show on a regular basis. I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Sandra at this point because it's her field. So.
That's perfect timing. Very good. Thank you very much, Juliette, for such an interesting paper. We go on then to Sandra, but before introducing her, I wanted to mention that we will extend our session today again, as we did last time. So instead of closing at 12:30, we will continue until 12:15 Lima time, to allow for a little bit more discussion. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce now Sandra Loger, Director of the Center for Contemporary Philosophy at the Institute of Philosophical and Juridical Sciences at La Sorbonne in Paris. She is a translator of most of Cavell's works into French and author of, among several books on Wittgenstein and Cavell, of Why We Need Ordinary Language Philosophy. Today, she will talk to us about her paper, TV Series and Moral Education. Sandra, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Juliette. I'm not going to talk about The Bachelor. I don't know it, but I'm very grateful for your presence. And I'm very happy to talk about popular culture because it's also a subject I share with Victor very much. So thank you. Thank you so much for that. And also I share with Toril the idea of this revolution in taking into account ordinary life and ordinary language. And Cavell was no doubt the first to account for the transformation of theory and criticism brought about by reflection on popular culture, and for him, it was mainstream cinema mainly, and he's less concerned with reversing artistic hierarchies than with the self-transformation required by our encounters with new experiences and with ordinary language. So I'm going to quote first. So I'm not, I don't know how to do the PowerPoint, but I'm going to put a few quotes in the chat. So just, check it if you, so I just need to, okay. Tout le monde. Okay, there's this passage that, okay, I missed the first sentence, but it's Robert Warshall, who is a critic, and some of you know him very well. It was Caver's inspiration on this matter of popular culture, and he really did this amazing analysis, and he has been so influential on Caver when he talks about the need of a criticism of popular culture, which can acknowledge its pervasive and disturbing power without ceasing to be aware of the superior claims of the higher arts. And what is funny in this quotation is that he talks about, this huge number of stimuli that present themselves to us in popular culture. And now this is so true, even more true, obviously. And also when he talks about, responding to Proust rather to Mickey Spillane or to Laurence Olivier rather than Sterling Hayden, it's interesting to see that what he gives as example of popular culture are now obviously high culture. And so this popular culture its value doesn't lie in great art, but in its transformative capacity, we find in moral perfectionism, in Emerson and Thoreau, and as well as philosophies, the education of grown-ups, obviously also film and culture have this task of education. There is a passage you all know that is in The Claim of Reason, when he speaks about confronting my words and life as I pursue them with the life my culture's world may imagine for me. And so it's the passage about the education of grown-ups, but you see, it's really about what my culture's words imagine for me. And this is why philosophy is the education of grown-ups. And this is why also Caver is interested in the apparently minor genre of remarriage comedies, which stage characters' mutual education and their transformation through separation and reunion. And so this educational value of popular culture is something that actually defines culture, defines this whole sense of Bildung also in the expression popular culture. And its vocation is the philosophical education of a public rather than the valorization of a socially targeted corpus. And so my thesis in the paper, if you have read it, is that what, the value Caver claimed for mainstream Hollywood film in the 70s, in The Worldview, and then in Pursuit of Happiness, has been transferred to television series, which have somehow taken over for film, not replaced it, of course, in the task of educating grown-ups and also adolescents. And if you want to define our shared, accessible, available heritage, we always think of the material of our ordinary conversations. So it's really, this really stems from ordinary language philosophy, and So before these conversations were about film or books, now among the young, of course, but also a good number of grown-ups, it's also often a TV series. And so what Warsaw and Kever said about film and about the fact that film was a resource for subjective improvement and to become a better person, it's something that you can now transfer to TV shows without film having, disappeared, of course. And so there's also, again, a passage by Robert Warsaw, and you can see the reasons why for Warsaw, TV, no, not TV, sorry, film was, the best opportunity for ordinary language criticism, popular culture criticism, because it was the most highly developed and most engrossing of the popular arts, and also seemed to have an unlimited power to absorb and transform the discordant elements of our fragmented culture. But when you read this definition, now it is a definition of the place TV has in our lives. And it's really something that asks from us a new assessment of importance, of what matters. And we all know that Wittgenstein called for transformation of our ideas of, what is important, what are the most important things. And this is something that is a transformation in hierarchies between great arts and ordinary cultural practices. So this is the background is same as for Juliet or for Toril. It's really ordinary language philosophy. And so what is important for Kever in film, in the popular nature of film, is the connection to ordinary life, a kind of intimacy with the ordinary, the film's experience, integration in the ordinary lives of the viewers. There's a very good essay on the ontology of film by Emmanuel Bourdieu, who is a sociologist, but also a philosopher and son of Pierre Bourdieu, who explained that Kever shows us why cinema is common, ordinary, shared, aesthetic experience. It's really, part of ordinary life. And this is why, for Kever, cinema's relation to philosophy implies learning what it means to have an experience, speak like Dewey, to check one's experience, to let the object or the work of your interest teach you how to consider it. And so this is really the education of experience by oneself with the circularity Emerson knows about, tells us about, having an experience requires having confidence in one's experience and also finding words to express one's experience. Very central theme in Kever's work that has been discussed in several presentations here. But I want just to stress this idea of the possibility of having an experience which is inseparable from the question of expression and the possibilities which film explores, but also TV, because of the attention to, with the small screen, to faces expressivity for human beings, natural expressivity. And so this is why you have this idea in Kever that our experience is made with this cinematographic moment, segments of experience, memories of a common life. And so this is how he defines the importance of film. And he, okay, just paste again something, sorry, to do this. It's easier this way. And so it's really about assessing your experience and, finding the words for what one is specifically interested to say. So here you see the connection between the experience of film, the everyday experience you have in TV for people who are, who like to watch them, and the practice of ordinary language. And there's also what Kaver says about film in the worldview, the fact that there is this whole proximity between the experience of film and what makes our experience ordinary, and this whole idea of the pedagogic and democratic aspect of the cinematographic experience. And you all know this quotation, but I really like it in the present context, rich and poor, those who care about no other art, and those who live in the promise of art. And so all care about movies, await them, respond to them, remember them, talk about them, and hate some of them, are grateful for some of them. And this is this democratic characteristic of the experience of film. Also the fact that, in film, we like the exceptional as much as the common, and the fact that you don't like the highest instances unless you also like, regular, typical ones, something Kaver cares much about. I think this is also something that connects the experience of film, as Kaver was describing it, when film were, big films were touching a huge audience, like millions of people, and what is happening with TV today. And so this is a very powerful experience. And also the fact that Kaver proposes a total change of perspective, and this is something he calls a revolution, and the revolution theory tells us about on film, popular culture in general, and the fact that the movies, what he says in the thought of movies, for example, popular movies have as much to tell us about, skepticism, Juliette was talking about that, philosophical matters as philosophy. And I'm thinking here of Stephen Mulhall also, who has described what sets Kaver's approach apart from those of other philosophers of cinema. It's totally different from the dominant approach, which consists in describing essential properties of the medium in order to prescribe its possibilities and its genre. And Kaver always advocates describing certain genre, certain artistic or visual successes in order to describe the possibilities of the medium. So it's really like Wittgenstein says that there is no essence of language that would prescribe its uses and norms, and no definition of concept that would determine their possible future application. So this conception of film comes from ordinary language philosophy, obviously, and it also works for film and for TV, for any popular genre. And TV shows are somehow absorbing all the film genre to produce new work, because the film genre provide a kind of expressive grammar for the creator, for the writers, but also for the viewer who finds within the genre resources for her own sentiments, situation. And TV shows are really explicitly sites for ordinary expression, and they're fed by moments of conversation. And there are always also allusion to TV classics or TV conversations in the great the great TV shows like in Buffy or Lost or How I Met Your Mother. There's always this background of, Hollywood comedy conversation. And there you have the viewer's ordinary expertise that comes from knowledge or even mastery of a genre. And I think there is this shared democratic nature of film and television that is also in a shared capacity of education. You all know that for Cavell, film shows these important moments of life where life changes, and these moments which in real life are fleeting, indeterminate, and whose importance sometimes takes years or a whole lifetime to understand. And this is something that is essential to the education of our ordinary experience. And my aim in working on TV shows, so this is what I'm trying to do in this paper, and also in more work, further work, a book I have written on TV series, the fact that this is something that is also inherited by TV, also by the fact that TV series provide education and have the huge ambition. And it's not only since HBO, it's really since the 90s, with shows like ER or Friends, The West Wing, the fact that you have characters that are integrated into viewers' ordinary and familiar lives, the fact that viewers are initiated into new forms of life, or for example, professional lives, and to new initially opaque vocabularies that are not made, heavily explicit as they were before, but that you have really to learn, like the Augustine character at the beginning of the investigation. And so this is why you have this narrativity and this methodology of series that make for their moral relevance and for their power, and also they lead us to revise somehow the status of morality, because they lead you to pay attention to ordinary behavior, to everyday choices, to individual styles of expressing themselves and making claims. And this is the transformation that has been already called for about literature, the fact that, the interest in literature, and this is something Toril and also Cora Diamond, Martin Nussbaum talk about, the fact that this material transform the whole idea of ethics and transform it into a kind of attention to a specificality of personalities. And this is why morality is constituted there by the claims of individuals and the recognition of a plurality of moral positions and voices within a world. So this kind of polyphony you have in many TV shows, I think it's something that also comes from this relation to ordinary ethics and ordinary language. And so here you have this perspective on ordinary culture that is inaugurated by Cavell, by Warsaw, and it makes it possible to perceive the moral importance of TV series, which now generate a great interest in our world, because many people watch them, but still there is still a critical discourse befitting the richness of the material and the creativity of the discipline that is not yet found. And so this is something maybe we need to use Cavell to find it. You know that for Cavell, films are constitutive of the viewer's experiences. So memories of moments in film are actual memories. But for me, TV inherits this power because TV series accompany us over the years. I mean, when you had, this very important TV series that had, at least 5 or sometimes 8 seasons, like Game of Thrones. So maybe there are less of these TV shows now. Maybe we can discuss that. But with this series, you had this audience attachment to the characters, and the fact that the TV shows take care somehow of their audience because they provide communities with words for conversation, they empower individuals with moral judgments, and present different point of view, but also they present us a character that are parts of our lives, who grow up or get older when while we get older and change. And so TV series have a place in the existence of the viewers and are incorporated to our experience, into our ordinary lives, because you have this ordinary repeated contact with characters who become friends, as in the show, or intimates. And so here, again, with this familiarity, this frequentation, this attachment of characters, there is also a way and a quest for an inheritance for the popular affairs pedagogical task of creating an inseparably subjective and public education. And there's and I will end with another quote by Warsaw, because I think this is something that is very important, I think, in the definition of the experience of TV, even if it's not something Warsaw was talking about, but it is also a passage Cavell discusses in his postface to the reedition of Warsaw, where Warsaw talks about the necessarily personal. And I really like this passage where he speaks about the writers having to invent his own audience, of the writer having to invent all the meanings of experience. So this is really the task. When he speaks about the writer, it's really about the critic. I think, again, we need to use and mobilize Cavell to find a way to do, TV experience or TV series criticism. And this is why Warsaw tells us about, the writer having to invent all the meanings of experience. And so, and the experience today, and Juliette showed this too, the experience is something that is so extended and diverse. And also when Warsaw mentions the intellectuals facing the necessity of, describing and clarifying an experience which has itself deprived him of the vocabulary he requires to deal with it. I'm sorry to end on a quotation that is not easy. It's the end of my paper too, which is much longer than what I have presented. But I think this is another definition of perfectionism connected to popular culture and the aesthetic demand to find and invent an audience and a personal search for words, ordinary words, to describe an experience that has precisely deprived you of the vocabulary you had, this and the vocabulary necessary to deal with that. And this is why popular culture, but especially today TV show, is the place for the education of grown-ups Cavell was calling for, and also in the process of becoming a subject by becoming part of discussing and sharing material that is together public and private and woven into everyday life. And this is also why, as Warsaw said, we are all self-made men and women, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Well, obviously the two are very much related. We have a question in the chat, which I would like to start from Mel Rima, who asks, how do you forecast the future of culture in case a bidirectional, that is interactive TV reach day-to-day life? I imagine this is a question for both speakers, and I just want to add something more. And the other difference between TV series and movies would be the fact that Juliet mentioned that there's a localization issue. I mean, there's something about the mobility of the mobile phones that how does that affect the effect that we're talking about of TV series and moral education, but also in terms of subjectivation, as Juliet was developing.
So maybe Juliet, about the mobility, the Apparatgeist, and I can add something. And also I had clips to show, but I will do it later after the first questions.
Right, so I think the mobile is interesting because of the environment of the idea of shaping your own habitus, your own piece of everyday life. And also because we are social animals who care about our status, we care about where we are. This is an anthropological point about humans. We want to know where we are in relation to groups. Now, this has both positive and negative aspects, obviously, with mobile technology. And, I quite agree with Sandra that democracy is very much at stake. And it's very interesting since 2016. Now, suddenly, this becomes an area of research for democracy. But I do think that we need to not forget our ordinary language philosophy when we talk about privacy, for example. There's all sorts of technological means of handling privacy. There's all sorts of legal issues, at least in the United States, about sexual privacy. There's a lot of feminism there. But I really think that if we're going to get anywhere, we have to focus on human-human interaction, face-to-face, and how to cultivate that. And so the educational moment is crucial for democracy. This is obviously Emerson, Thoreau, Dewey, and everybody else. And so I think interactive TV, to the extent that we can exploit that in positive ways, this is something Stanley really taught me. Look for ways to repair the social fabric while acknowledging moral difference. And so that perspective on ethics that, again, Sandra was mentioning, ahead of time, you're not going to agree with everybody on what the right response is. And morality begins from that point. And then what words do we give to one another? So maybe the interaction is not just a matter of causing people to have thoughts. I really am against this picture. It's really about humans learning to interact with one another in inventive ways.
Thank you, Juliet. I really think that this whole idea of interaction is really about also all the conversations people have about these shows, and the fact also that they are built by using, the expectations of the audience, and so there's a very specific way of fabricating these shows, and also I didn't have enough time to stress also the huge differences that were so obvious during the lockdown. The fact that going to the movies is going out and for caviar with a bunch of friends, preferably male apparently, and so the TV is more kind of domestic, underrated way of creativity. So there is a huge difference, but as Juliet has shown, also now TV is disconnected from the box and the actual TV set, and people travel and they're always watching shows on their phones in public transportation. So there's this domesticity, but also the delocalization, and also the fact that people watch these things very often together, not only, you know, as an individual, but you all know about, you know, these couples who watch TV shows together and don't want to watch on their own an episode, so they have to somehow, you know, when someone travels, they have to pretend that they haven't seen it, and so on. So there are these phenomena that makes this genre very, very domestic, but also all over the place. This is which is interesting.
Thank you. There's Nicholas, William, Bill, and Stefan in that order. Nicholas, please.
All right, thank you. Thanks for both the papers. I mean, I really appreciated the aspects brought forth, things which maybe I haven't thought about that much in questions of popular culture. I mean, I'm kind of generalizing here now. Now, I mean, for me, the obvious, I mean, question which you didn't address that much was kind of you brought forth, maybe not exclusively, maybe a little bit oversimplifying the thing, but as it were, positive aspects of popular culture. Now, so my first reaction is just how would you then react or address the types of concerns that have been raised about popular culture? I mean, of course, the whole history of philosophy is somehow related to to something we might call the popular culture or doxa in many ways, or something like that. But maybe I'm thinking more specifically here about the early Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer, and then also, I mean, when we're talking about Wittgenstein, Otto Weining and Schoenberg and Karl Kraus, and these that developed a response to what's being called the Viennese modernity as a kind of response, and their response to that, I think, have a lot of similarities or kind of overlaps with issues that are present in our relation to popular culture. So that would be just one question, and kind of a little bit elaborating on that. To take one question, I mean, I think Sandra, you talked about TV series being, as it were, forms of education for grown-ups. Now that seems, I mean, in many respects, I gather that's true. I mean, there are great TV series which you can learn a lot about. So one question would be questions about criteria. I mean, what are what's good education, what's not? But more in terms of, I think one phenomena, at least, which seems to be relevant, is that despite these series being potentially education for grown-ups, there's a question about I don't know what term to use here. Let's call the media, or the supply, or the amount, of output that's there, and the access we have to it, and the immediate access. So there's a form of where these potentially educational formats and medias become forms of enjoyment or consumption. That seems to be the driving motive, or a very relevant, as it were, dynamic going on there, that this is a consumption of enjoyment linked, and to what extent that is. And this brings me to the question of democratization of art and culture, which especially you, Sandra, put forth in your paper. Now it seems not, I mean, I gather that the important question here, with terms of in relation to democracy, seems to be, or one important question at least, is that is it so that let's call it the internet, the potential for anybody to put out their own voice, as it were, to present their own voice, now, is that democratization, or is it a form of market logic being? So if you have a free potential market, and those that are consumed, their voices are heard. So and of course this is this would be the constellation of questions I would have.
Thank you. I will let Juliet answer about the internet, but I really thank you for the question because it's really the main point of what we're doing, because actually this is why we really need CAVER to back up what we're trying to do, me and other people on TV, because what you say, the worries you have now on TV is exactly what was said about popular film when CAVER was writing about it, because it was really about, we don't know, the quality of the staff, and this is why he wrote this essay called The Good of Film, because obviously we don't know what is a good film, but what is a good film is something that makes you better somehow. And so this is why we really need to show how some TV shows, not all, I agree with you, but some of them. There's one, for example, Avner likes the French show Le Bureau des Légendes, for example, which is a very good show, or Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is probably not what Avner likes, but maybe some of you. So some shows do have this status that CAVER was claiming for film. So this is why, the idea that something is not, strong enough or serious enough because it is a kind of large audience thing. This is something he really wanted to, to criticize, but it's always something that is, worth fighting for. And for me, this whole idea of democracy, obviously there are some worries, and you are totally right about internet and so on. But many criticism of TV shows for me are very anti-democratic, not yours, but because they are often based on the fact that, if something is very popular and many people like it, then it's not a good thing, because the viewers are somehow very passive, or, and I think it's very, for me, it's important to actually find ways to criticize that, because or Adorno, Frankfurt School inspired criticism, because it's always a way to imagine the other people being unable to, having the same critical stance as the one you are having. So I'm always very careful about not having this stance. But I agree with you that sometimes you need to be skeptical. So sorry, Juliet, maybe you want to add something?
No, I think that was wonderful, especially about shows like The Bachelor, which, obviously have mastered the technique, reality TV shows, of marketing the individuals who are real individuals who are on there to become celebrities. So, I mean, of course, Nicholas, the idea that it all exists in a sort of commercialization of the virtual self, and that young people now face very powerful forces, visibly powerful forces. Okay, porn is the largest, industry on the internet. There are lots of forces there that are dissipatory. And I think that that's undeniable. And of course, nothing we're saying could possibly deny that. But I really share Sandra's view that, to put yourself as an intellectual above the young teenagers, for example, who are watching a show like The Bachelor, as if there's nothing there and they're just little marionettes being manipulated, that has its anti-democratic side, and also has its side of not listening to part of what people are struggling with in a particular generation, however imperfectly. And it's also not to respect the writers and editors who learn how to script this in such a way that, rightly or wrongly, people feel that this is relevant to their own lives. So this is a Cavelian point, and I really agree with Sandra. We need Cavell to keep us going in the face of all the negatives. Obviously, this is very powerful technology, duh. I mean, this is, in my view, this is one of the things Wittgenstein means when he talks about this dark time. I mean, he was an engineer. He knew you couldn't drop atomic weaponry on a civilian population without massive computing power. So, this is dangerous stuff. Obviously, conflicts come out and get rigorized in wrongful ways now on social media. But in my paper, what I tried to do is to show that, you know, this problem about how to share facts, if you like, or the truth, that's actually a problem for science itself. It's not that we're going to fix this with a critical theory or say a Vienna type positivist theory where, you know, we've just got to have really good science and then the public is going to learn, for example, how to vaccinate itself. No, what we're learning, especially during the pandemic, is you actually have to go out there and be an anthropologist and talk to people and listen. How does it look to them? And this is a very big challenge, but I think it's a challenge for each of us as individuals as well as a whole. And therefore, I'm pretty optimistic that that part of humanity, given language and given what we need, is not going to be erased. Yes, there will be some people who prefer sex robots to humans. There's no doubt about that. I think we know that already. But that doesn't mean that it's for the rest of us. So preferences and how they're articulated, all of that is still very powerful. I wouldn't underestimate the force of that kind of normativity.
Yes, Bill, please.
I think my question is has been to some extent handled, but I guess I want to speak to a specific point with it. And I need to apologize. My internet may be spotty. I hope you can hear me and that it's consistent. Yeah, I think Nicholas touched on much of what I wanted to suggest. I guess what I want to ask, and this is in part because both Juliet and Sandra have used the word democracy, and it does in some cases bleed over into get identified with the popular. That's what I want to, and actually it's prompted by a passage from The Thought of Movies that Sandra has in her paper, and that I'll just put in the chat, which is at least a large part of what Cavell means by democracy, it seems to me, especially where he speaks of the cursedness of the popularity of film. When it's democratized, what happens is that you realize that to get the sense of the film, it's not going to be something that somebody hands you. It's going to be something that you need to perceive at the moment as it's passing by. And you may miss it on a first or 20th viewing. And then that's on you, right? The way that film operates is there are these moments like reality that require that you notice them, notice their import, think about how they have certain implications that you may not recognize. It seems that's what's crucial with democracy. And as somebody who's interested, I guess, in popular but no longer popular arts like opera, like jazz music, where there are communities for whom these points are crucial in thinking about their own moral development. It seems to me that the good part of democracy is still present there. The popularity seems like a different concern. Or, I mean, it leads to many of the things that both Juliet and Sandra have spoken to, ways in which new kinds of communities get formed. But I think when Cavell speaks of democracy, he's thinking in particular about the demands on the individual to see what is there and to respond, not because some expert or highbrow person tells you it's there, but because you see it or hear it there.
Thank you. This is, I think it's more a comment than the question. And it's really the definition of a democracy. Totally right. Our capacity to, decide our tastes and, what matters to us. So that's very true.
Yeah, I guess I completely agree. Of course, the numbers aren't, in a sense, what matters. Although the numbers, you know, in the investigations, Wittgenstein does embed that little allusion to Marx and Hegel, where, you know, a quantitative change does or can become a qualitative change. It's a beautiful little example of his inserting an allusion to Hegel without telling you that he's doing it. So of course the popular is not, but to me, for example, opera and jazz during the pandemic, you know, it's quite remarkable how musicians have reached out and developed incredibly new and interesting ways of choral groups, symphonies, the drive to, you know, syncretize traditional opera with, you know, detective shows and God knows what else. So I think this syncretic power of what's merely popular, but what gets rearranged inventively, you know, that's part of what you're talking about too. So, you know, popular is a good concept. We probably should investigate that concept a little bit more. Also, knowing what is popular is not a trivial thing. I don't think that numbers alone are, numbers are very important, but, you know, I don't know whether people really have a sense of what's going on out there. I wouldn't, you know, think that it's obvious that we do know quite what's popular right now. And so it becomes a topic actually of research in its own right to try to figure out what popular means. I think that that would be my sort of philosophical response to the idea of popular.
All right, thank you, Juliet and Sandra. In this order, Stefan, Toro, and Byron.
It's lovely papers. I think can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think my question is also related to the previous two questions, but it's maybe more directed to Sandra, because I'm fascinated and interested in this notion of public education. So I was going to ask you what you actually mean by public education and by this notion of the public. And I'm asking for a number of reasons. First, going to movies today is different than movie going, like Cavell speaks of. So to put it very like crudely, it's like there was only one screen available when he started movie going, and now we've got so many screens available, and we can watch movies and series on so many devices, and we can stop watching, you know, we can rewatch again. Whereas movie going in his time, well, at least as I understood, is like this collective activity. And another reason is that in order, and this is also Cavell, in order to learn our position about certain issues, about what we find necessary, valuable, etc., we need to be able to convene. But specifically today, convening has changed a lot. In pandemic times, we convene in different ways digitally now, and that also raises questions about how we come together, how we gather as an audience. So those are two reasons, kind of as the background to my question is how do you understand public education in relation to the expression of interest in TV series?
Thank you. I try to answer, but when I speak about public education, I really think about, you know, an education that is provided to a very large audience. So it's not only an education that is provided in the public space, because TV shows are really about well, initially at least about the private space, but as you know, Dewey defines, you know, the public and democracy with the idea of, you know, seemingly private questions that become somehow public. And this is the definition of politics for Dewey. So for me, public has really more political sense than a spatial sense. Also because the TV series genre was at first, you know, directed at, you know, women at home, and it became more ambitious somehow in the 90s, where it changed for primetime shows like ER that were watched by a wider audience, but it still has a relation to private life and ordinary life. And you just see it by the fact that you have much more, women and minorities characters in TV shows than in film, even if film is. So this whole idea of the public, which is the very important political question, is really related to the private world, underestimated origin of TV shows, and this is also what interests me in it.
I guess I would add to that, of course, now we have the phenomenon of unplugging going on, where people are going to start cultivating separate, $5 a month subscriptions based on content. And, to get $5 out of somebody a month, you better have content that's going to speak to them. And so the breakdown of these cable networks is, I think, going to shift things, but again, shift things toward public and dewy sense, and toward the pragmatic sense that people will select content that's helping them and doing things for them. And I think in some ways we may get together in better qualitative ways. At least that would be the hope. The other thing I wanted to say is just that the power of this technology is to amplify. It amplifies negative things and it amplifies positive things. And that means that in a way, even if you are taking a Frankfurt School or Karl Kraus perspective, the point is that there is in a way nothing hidden. I mean, once these terrible aspects of social media come out, it makes visible to people what they really want and what they really care about and what they don't want. So again, without sounding too Pollyannish, I think the bad outcomes can sometimes mobilize people to see better what they really want and what they really don't want.
Thank you. Yes, Toro.
Right. Hi. Okay. I hope have I unmuted myself?
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay, good. So my question is really, I suppose, mostly for Sandra, but I want to say how fascinating I found Juliet's paper, and particularly for me, the section about Blade Runner, given that I often use it in my classes and teach it. And I feel that Juliet's perspective will be the perfect addition to the discussion of skepticism, because now I can think more clearly about technique and so on in relation to it. So I have already asked Juliet to send me the paper since I can't find it in the box or something. Anyway, as for the popular television series and so on, I have a small question and a comment. First of all, the Frankfurt School thing. I think the problem with the Frankfurt School, the Adorno and Horkheimer and so on, from our point of view as critics in ordinary language philosophy, is that they're just laying down a set of theoretical parameters that must be generally true for all times. It's this kind of craving of generality that drives them. So that leads them to these totally untenable claims about jazz, for example, that it's all supposed to be invalid, so that anyone who picks up the idea that in advance and without look and see, right, that there's got to be something unworthy about television series, for example, it's just not. We have to argue against that. It runs counter to ordinary sense of justice as well. I mean, you just don't dismiss whole genres because you disagree with how they have been produced. So that's I just totally supportive commentary of Sandra. But so I'll just say my piece, and then Sandra can join me and so on. But So then we get to the question of quality. And I was thinking, what is the role of the critic, or if you like, the thinker or philosopher here? Because Sandra was saying quite correctly that a lot of people get a lot out of and can do their own moral reflection and so on from thinking about television series or whatever. But then Cavell, after all, troubled to write books about movies, and he selected his movies very carefully. And the reason for that is my experience as a critic is that I always, when I read a piece of criticism, that there is a specific way that we can go wrong very easily, which is this: we select for our criticism a piece of work, I don't care whether it's a classic or a movie or literature, whatever, that can't actually stand or take the critical pressure we put on it. That is, it sort of collapses under the investigation, and then we've done so much work that we publish it anywhere, but then we feel like the result is critical overkill, that you sort of go that the work can't take it. And I think that what Cavell teaches us, I'm sure he had notes and discarded a ton of notes on movies he decided just couldn't hold up to the pressure. And so the act of the critic, to my mind, is to select and find what she can stand for as an interesting work, and then share that with others. It's not to lay down general criteria for whole genres or anything. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, how, and this is something I struggle with, what do we do with work we find? They may be popular or they may be classics or whatever, but for one reason or another, we have come to despise and detest them. That is, we think, because the act of acknowledgement of the work is trying to acknowledge what the work's concepts and interests are and get clear on them. But sometimes the result of that can be that we really just feel we've seen that and we hate it. And this is partly, when that happens to me, I mostly decide never to write about that thing. So silence would be one response. But there's another way in which sometimes there may be part of the education of grown-ups to actually take the trouble to show why this doesn't hold up, even though we begin with the attitude of acknowledgement. Because I get often the question, well, isn't acknowledgement just praise and you'll never be critical and so on? So I'd like to end on that.
Thank you. These are so important questions. So thank you so much. Actually, this is also why I began with the Warsaw quote about we need a criticism, mode of critique for popular culture, which was, totally lacking. And this is why he was writing, and this is why Stanley found him so exciting. And I think it's really the problem right now with TV shows, because there is no established, even profession of TV criticism. In France, it's something that is even more obvious. I'm sorry if I talk about my country, but you know that film, Nouvelle Vague film stems from criticism. I mean, the cinema comes from Bazin, Panofsky. So there is this very close link, and you don't have that at all with criticism. TV, which is very, informal, people who, begin to write on TV for some reasons, but they're in their, sometimes just, because they are part of the industry, sometimes because they feel like writing, like I do in Libération, you see. So, but there is no, there is this great book by Emily Nussbaum, which is which is called I Like to Watch, and which it also explains how she became a, series critic, but it's there is no no organized definition, no profession. And also our problem as to who really work on this stuff is that there's no corpus somehow, even if there are all the great shows of the 90s and HBO, but you know, you cannot tell to your kids to watch, you know, The West Wing you know, it's much shorter to watch a movie. I mean, it's really a huge amount of time. And so it's very hard to also establish a corpus. So actually, thanks to the lockdown, many people began to watch classics like The Wire, like The West Wing, like Friends. Everybody was watching Friends, but it's really thanks to the lockdown. So we cannot wish for that. And so I think these are two reasons. There's no profession, there's no connection between the critic and kind of corpus. And so this is why this is really what is at stake now, you know, to have a kind of criticism for TV. And so about also shows that you hate, I would like to have examples actually. This is very interesting because there's also the concept of hate watching, which I really don't like. You know, it was invented for this show Emily in Paris. I don't know if some of you have seen it, but many people were saying that they were watching it and hating it. And I wrote a paper to say that, you know, if you are watching it, you are not hating it. I mean, but with TV, anyway, it's a kind of temporality that there are, you know, many episodes, and you can decide after one or two episodes that you hate a show and don't want to watch it, which is not the case with a movie. When you don't like a movie, you always stay until the end. I mean, it's of course the minimum. So I think for what you asked, the very, you know, material conceptions of watching, what it is to watch a TV show, it's also very, very important. And but I try to think more. But what show do you hate, Toril?
Well, the thing is, I was thinking as you were talking, which ones did I give up on? Very often what happens with a TV show, everyone tells me to watch it, and I try 2 episodes, and then I'm thinking, my life is too short for this. This is not going to happen. But of course, now I've blanked on all of them precisely because they don't. I can mention one that I stuck for the whole of the short first series, but I really thought it was so disappointing in the end. And that was, of course, and I like watching Norwegian television shows if I can, because I'm so far away from home and so on. So there's the one called Occupied, which has a fantastic concept. The Russians invade Norway, and the American embassy is no help, and dreadful, capitalistic, horrible people. So all great, right? But somehow
it's so bad. It's so bad. I hated it.
The characters.
The acting. I think it's because the acting is so bad, actually, because the idea is
everything sort of broke, and they had some interesting setups. I mean, the whole sort of frame could have been so good, but I just couldn't bear any more of it. And the question is, with the education for grown-up things, like I have never written a line on that show, and I don't intend to. But I mean, how do we get something more of a general conversation of why certain things strike us as subtle and interesting and endlessly fascinating in this genre?
If I may say something, Toril, these comments are just so, they're so great. I mean, I appeal to the notion of, I take up the mantle of experimental philosophy at the opening of my paper. And I do that quarreling very much with what most philosophers mean by experimental philosophy, which includes looking into people's brains. And obviously, I don't think that that's what we should be doing. So experimental in the sense of, you know, to allude to Byron's discussion of found footage and montage. Part of what we're going to need out of this criticism is, and I guess this is an Austinian idea, we have to talk about the failures. What's wrong with that? You know, why put the critic into the role of somehow being the taste setter for everyone else, when you know ahead of time, people are going to have specific foibles and limitations in terms of what they can encompass. I can't see Game of Thrones because since my first husband died, I can't handle violence. It's just out. So, you know, we need to talk about that. Some people can't follow along, and that's okay. There still could be a criticism. We don't really have, as Sandra says, the profession, but I mean, an idea here, at the risk of confusing the popular with democratic, is maybe we all have to become our own critics. Really, we do. And you know ahead of time, you know, that not everyone is going to agree. So what philosophy can learn from that, I think, if we do try to develop criticism, you know, is taking that factor into account. And I guess that's what I meant by appealing to the idea of found footage and experimental philosophy. I think we're very early on and we don't really know how this world is going to be in many ways. And so an appropriate sense of tentativeness is a good thing.
Just a small thing, because for once I disagree with Juliet. Just on one point, I don't think we can be our own critics, you know, for children. I mean, no important art or practice can survive or develop without a criticism, professional, important criticism. And this is why the film has developed. So we still need that. But
we need that, but of course, I'm not disagreeing with that. I didn't intend to deny that, Sandra.
I know, me too. I agree with you too.
But I think we have to anticipate, shall I say, that the voicing of criticism has a special kind of newfound, how shall I put it, difficulty of subjective authority in this kind of circumstance. You know, when I ask students, when I teach social media, I'll ask them at the beginning of the class, just get up at the board and tell us what platforms you use. And suddenly it's clear they're revealing intimate things about themselves that are kind of scary to share. I think this is the atmosphere of criticism that makes it challenging, Sandra. So I don't differ with you about the need for a profession, but I think that this issue of voicing and intimacy and idiosyncrasy is newly difficult.
But can I just, my final thought, I mean, it's not my final thought because I'm always thinking about these things, but criticism, as I think of it, is the act of responding to the work. I wasn't thinking of it as just dismissing stuff. And then without some kind of critical discourse, you can't. agree with Sandra again. It's horrendous how much I agree with Sandra, but the thing is,
terrible.
You do, for example, Cavell's work on film has actually helped to form a new canon of great American movies that wasn't like that before. And since I have come up through literary studies and I've studied the Western literary canon for years and years and years, and the point about it is it's created by two things. First of all, the work of critics, but secondly, also the fact that new critics and new students respond to these works, so that it's perfectly well known that Shakespeare's reputation took a huge dip in the 18th century. The 18th century rewrote the ends, couldn't stand that Cordelia died and changed it and so on. And so these things will go in historical waves, but critics and the discussion, you see, it won't happen without conversation. I'm not there to tell my students that they cannot like something, but I am there to help them articulate their own criteria and put them in conversation with other criteria. And that can be totally transformative. So anyway, I'll shut up now.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Byron.
Hi, so it's a real pleasure and very important for me to be able to talk with both of you about these topics. So obviously I share I mean, my question is largely about Cavell, and I share the ambition of bringing Cavell into contexts of digitization. But also I wanted to raise a question having to do with a problem that I've myself encountered when it comes to bringing Cavell into context of digitization, and having to do with the limits and possibilities of talking about production when it comes to Cavell on film, Cavell on audiovisual media, and that kind of thing. And it also occurs to me that this is a version of a question I think Stephen once raised to me following a presentation of a paper I gave on Cavell on film in Lima. And it's that, so.
Wait, Stephen has disappeared now somehow. Okay, never mind. Go ahead.
That's so my acknowledgement of Stephen has
exactly.
gone unreceived. So questions about this digitization obviously raise questions about production. This is, as opposed to being in the position of just a spectator. This is central to Juliet's paper. It also appears in Sandra's paper. Sandra, on the third page of your paper, you say the democratization of artistic production promised by Romanticism would thus be realized in the new artistic forms and modes of participation and interaction that digital technology allows, opening the way for new forms of subjective authority. But of course, the problem is the limits that I'm alluding to is the emphasis that Cavell gives to the position of the spectator as opposed to the position of the producer when it comes to film and audiovisual media. I'm referring to things like the preface of The World Viewed, where he says that he's focusing on the experience of the film as opposed to knowledge of technique. I'm thinking of the emphasis on film, watching film, seeing film, the position of the spectator in the first edition of The World Viewed as a matter of relief from the responsibilities of agency. And obviously I'm referring to the famous statement in More of the World Viewed, where he says that film is a moving image of skepticism. Now there are some interesting exceptions to this. I think there's an interesting exception in the passage from The Thought of Movies that Sandra quotes and that Bill put in the chat, having to do with where Cavell briefly takes the position of the filmmaker, talking about holding the camera on the subject. There are also interesting exceptions sort of outside of Cavell's own writing, where, I mean, for example, when he appeared on Robert Gardner's TV program, Screening Room, and with Standish Lauder. And so the context kind of invited him to talk about questions of production that he had otherwise tended to ignore. And so, so my question is, but at the same time, there is of course this emphasis on film as a matter of, well, shaping our forms of life, to borrow Juliet's phrase. So there's this kind of tension between Cavell's emphasis on the position of the spectator as opposed to questions of production. I mean, another thing that I forgot to mention is, of course, his general de-emphasis on artisanal forms of filmmaking, like the general de-emphasis on home movies in The World Viewed. So this is a kind of, so there's a tension between that side of Cavell and questions about shaping film as shaping our forms of life that really comes to a fore when it comes to context of digitization, because what it is now to receive a film, what it is now to receive a TV show is typically to be in the position of a producer, of reappropriating images. Reappropriating images for the purposes of memes and things like that. I mean, here in Mexico, among the most popular meme formats come from telenovelas from the 90s, like Maria la del Barrio and Yo Soy Betty la Fea. Those are the memes that people reappropriate. Those are the images that people reappropriate for comic or satiric effect, political effect in memes on social media, WhatsApp stickers, and that kind of thing. So it's so this is the context that we're in that brings to a fore the tension between Cavell's emphasis on relief from responsibility when it comes to being in the position of the spectator versus film, are receiving film as a matter of shaping a form of life, again, to borrow Juliet's phrase. So this is a problem that I've encountered when it comes to digitization in Cavell, and I'd just like to invite both of you to say something about that.
Juliet, you want to start?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean,
Okay.
production and consumption are all kind of mixed up, aren't they?
Mm.
It comes to social media and memes and texting, the hashtag phenomenon, you know, is that producing or is that consuming? Things get to be really very mobile and dynamic with one another. But I guess to go back to Wittgenstein, Byron, I mean, I see what you're saying about Stanley's work on film. I quite understand that there's work to be done in adapting what might be regarded as tensions. But again, the thing from Wittgenstein that I guess I took with Forms of Life and everything I learned from Stanley about Wittgenstein is the thoroughgoing immersion of production in experience. I mean, experience itself is produced in a variety of different ways, one of which might mean listening to what the film tells you. But the idea of a dichotomy between production and consumption, I take it that's one of Wittgenstein's major attacks in the investigation. And I think it's confirmed by the memes and the activities that you're talking about on social media. So in a way, there's a way to take this toward the earlier question about the Frankfurt School and whether we're just, you know, marionettes in a consumption machine and so on. But no, I guess I don't see this as a tension in Cavell. It's just something that has to be developed for a new set of media. And those media will be adapted in various ways from other media. So I'm thinking about Henry James and social media. You know, what are the media that he developed in a literary context that might find graphic forms now, echoes like that. So now I work with computer scientists and cyber law people sometimes, and then I think the tension is really there. Okay, so they want to know about mechanisms of measuring differential privacy according to algorithmic measures, or they want to know rules for the law about sexual privacy. And are you going to bring that under, you know, First Amendment privacy, or are you going to bring that under, you know, other forms of privacy? So we get into the mechanics, and in those venues, I must say that I really find emphasizing ordinary language philosophy is incredibly helpful, because people in those venues who are interested in the production really have lost sight very often of how important ordinary responses are. And I remember the week before Facebook stock plunged by 10%, I was having a roundtable with computer scientists on algorithms and bias and accountability, and people were going on and so on. And I said, look, you know, all we have to do is unplug from Facebook and Zuckerberg is dead. And everyone laughed at me in that room. And, you know, the next week their stock was down. So I don't know, production and consumption, maybe we have to think about production and experience in new ways.
Thank you.
Sandra, would you like to add something?
I think Juliet has answered.
Okay, Stephen.
I had my hand up for a moment, but I've lowered it, so please go right ahead.
Okay. Victor, you had a question?
Yes, I do have a question, in fact. And this is
I want to show my clip, so.
Right.
Yeah.
It just has to do with, it's directed more to Juliet, and it has to do with my concern about what Stiegler calls the pharmacological nature of technology. You know, the fact that it's one at the same time a remedy and a poison. Mm-hmm. And I take Cavell in elaborating on Wittgenstein to bring in what, you know, is a therapeutic, or what I like to call a clinical perspective, right? Aware of a tendency of language and language users to misuse words, to trick ourselves and to get lost. And I wonder, and I think that technology in a way simply mirrors this in its own ambivalence, right? So I guess my question is, where do you see that clinical aspect? Because in reading your paper, I find the positive. I don't find you're concentrating on a negative. And in fact, in all the conversations we're hearing here, you kind of try to emphasize the fact that there's, you know, we can unplug a Zuckerberg, for instance, right? So I guess my question is, where do you see that clinical aspect in the Apparatgeist methodology that you're introducing? And I'm not sure either if Apparatgeist is just a methodology or Apparatgeist is a description of the digital age. I mean, what do you say of the issue raised as a concern about the numbing or annulling effect of the use of algorithms in a social network, which seems to shortcut, I think, the ability to take decisions and be, and deliberately choose an alternative way of action, say, or thought, precisely in those choices that would encourage, right, or make possible the free choice necessary for what you are calling the cultural search, this emphasis on sort of figuring out the new phraseologies, as you say, and so on and so forth. So that's my question is, what do you say about this negative sort of pharmacological dark side of technology in its grip on society? It seems to me that you're somehow either ignoring it or underestimating it. I mean, I don't know if you know Bernard Stiegler, but in reading you, I find him being in agreement with you in many ways, but he emphasizes this danger. And I'm wondering what you have to say about that.
Well, the dangers which were not being celebrated in that particular piece are indeed obvious. And, half of me is a terrible pessimist. I mean, I really don't know if democracy in an institutional sense in the United States is going to survive. I am worried. I think, though, that there is this tendency to blame technology for the problems, which of course one should, but it amplifies human nature. Okay, so when Mark Zuckerberg said, this is great on Facebook, everybody will be able to say anything they want to everyone else. If you had any sense for thinking for 5 seconds, you would realize that sounds like a complete dystopia. And there are dystopic aspects, of course. Now, journalism is something that I worked on initially with Katz. We had one of the first fake news conferences before the 2016 election. Very few people were talking about fake news until Trump was elected. So we do have this problem of paranoia being produced by the press, not Sandra's writings, but in other words, hysteria, mass hysteria. So I do think that mental health issues, the clinical turn, rethinking what perhaps Freud has to teach us on desire, these are things you do in your book a bit. I think that's all extremely important. And I find that among the students I teach who are really worried about their virtual selves, this is, an actual problem. But to the ills of the world, we're there. And as I say, we're only at the beginning, and the new forms of horror about what can happen, ghosting people, stalking people, we're only at the beginning of seeing exactly how bad that can get. And I take it obviously politically, we're in a dangerous situation in many ways. But, the optimistic thought is, well, okay, words to some extent got us into this, and to some extent we have to hope that words can get us out. So I try to emphasize these ethical points and Cavelian, more positive, ordinary language points when I'm talking to cynical computer scientists and cyber law experts who have extremely pessimistic views. And by the way, in those communities, there are a lot of people who think, for example, privacy's over, let's just forget about it. Don't worry about these algorithms. And actually, Sandra has a very nice paper on nudging for a volume. I'm now writing a paper on nudging and privacy. So of course, we're playthings of these algorithms, but it's very, very important, okay, not to give intellectual credibility to these economists who are still working with the same rational choice model, just souped up. They call it behavioral economics, big deal. It's still basically, enlarging the framework of assessment slightly. It's very, very important that we not allow that to be regarded as the fundamental mover and shaker of humanity. That's very important. And I take the clinical turn to be part of that too. but that's an older, historically well-known thing that the Frankfurt School is, of course, sensitive to. The question is, what do we do in the face of all of that? And, you know, discussing behavioral economics, I don't know, is there's a certain cynicism there that maybe we get too close to too quickly. And I'm concerned about that, which explains why I may sound like, you know, a naive girl in the woods.
Yeah,
But
no,
I can assure you, I have very pessimistic views about a lot of things.
not naive at all. No, but I did. I mean, insofar as technology is an extension of ourselves, and therefore an extension of precisely what Wittgenstein and Cavell saying. What is the therapeutic side of your Apparatgeist methodology? And that's what I was wondering. So. We'll keep talking about that. I know Sandra has a beautiful clip that she wants to show, but Greg Spencer has been writing several interesting comments here. I would like him to please pick up the mic and choose some of the ideas you've been throwing at us, please.
Great.
There's just one thing has been coming into my mind, which is whether we are actually looking at a reversal of Foucault's notion of the panopticon here. Because a modern author, producer, if you're doing a modern fantasy series for Netflix, then your life is on a knife edge. The reaction to it in the fan base can destroy your career instantly. It's like a game show where the audience has this power to just press the buttons and you just vaporize. Now, you are on full view in the center of the panopticon. And because the digital channels are so entangled, multiplicitous, and hidden, you know, they're very different from the world of art production that Cavell would always have written about, where you did have to worry about the critics on the big newspaper critics. The big name critics could be really scary, and if you didn't get things right with them, that could spell the end, that could be career ending. But you kind of knew who they were, where they were, what their outlooks were. You could predict what was going to happen. And I am absolutely astonished that we've actually still got young fantasy writers coming through and actually even trying things, because for every one that thrives, there's just, and they don't just sort of have a bit of a flop. They get annihilated. It's the first time I've pictured it that way, but it makes sense to me. I don't know.
Thank you.
That's nice.
Yeah, thank you for the comment.
Very good.
Thank you very much. Now, so Sandra, would you show that clip, please?
Actually, I have to apologize because this is not at all about TV shows, because of course there's this for Cavell. People like us who are interested in the media, there's this big phenomenon of TV, but TV has not been yet completely influenced by Cavell. So we have to wait for that. And there's this other phenomenon, and possibly maybe mostly in Europe, where filmmakers have read Cavell and write film and are influenced by him. And I think this is a new and important thing. When Victor was in Paris a few years ago, we watched a film by Arnaud de Pléchin, who is a quite famous French director. Even maybe you don't know him, but he's really one of the greatest now. And he was also influenced by Cavell and friends with him. And I really wanted to show this small clip of one of his latest movie called Les Fantômes d'Ismaël. It's in 2017, so it's really quite recent. And for this film, at the very end of the film, he uses Little Did I Know. So he uses the last page of Little Did I Know. And what is funny is that I was really in trouble yesterday and talking with Victor, because I told him, the clip was in French, so it would be so difficult. And then I realized you know, I have the subtitles, because the subtitles are the very end of Little Did I Know, and the actors are saying literally, so the French translation of this passage from Little Did I Know. So I'm going to try to show it if I can. I have to share my screen, so I need to do several things that are very difficult for me, because I'm not like Juliet. I'm not. So I am allowed to share the screen. So you are also going to see this great actress. So it's with Marion Cotillard, and so you. Okay, so this is the first clip. I hope you had the subtitles and were able to read them, and you have this great work by Laszlo Szabo and Marion Cotillard. And one of the last words in Little Did I Know, that's not my job. And so Marion Cotillard is saying what Stanley was saying to his father. So I think it's very, very striking. And he thanked at the end of the movie. So do I have the time for another clip? Yeah, because actually it's going to be even more difficult because it's going to be in Spanish. So for many of you, I guess it's going to be fine, but I only have it with French subtitles. So maybe this is not as fine, but I also, it's a very recent movie, and in Europe, it has been a very successful. Very okay, yeah. Did I? Oh, I'm sorry. I sent only to Stephen the subtitles, but no one else had them. Am I right? And you've been really good because
I sent them to the general.
I feel better. I feel so embarrassed. So this is something totally different, but it's a Spanish movie called Virgen de Agosto, very recent. So it was very successful, but with the lockdown, no one could see it. So now it's on. You can find it on video on demand. But it's a very, very nice movie with a young woman who is in the summer in Madrid, and she's subletting an apartment to this nice gentleman that you are going to see. And I just want to, it's very short again, but I really want you to see this. Sorry, oops. Well, maybe I need to.
¿Tomar algo?
Un poco de agua.
Necesito desconectar un poco, salir de la ciudad y el calor.
¿A dónde vas a ir?
La primera quincena de agosto a Valencia. Mi madre ha muerto hace poco y tengo que arreglar cosas con mis hermanos.
Oh, lo siento, no sabía.
Una muy mayor. Estaba ya bastante mal. Se vino abajo cuando se murió mi padre, hace ya 3 años. Y de repente huérfano. Pero bueno, estos días me he podido entretener con un artículo que me han encargado para una revista. En realidad era una necrológica también, sobre Stanley Cavell, un filósofo norteamericano.
Lo conozco.
Eso es muy interesante. Leo mucho sobre cine. ¿Puedo fumar? Hice conocido con un libro sobre comedias de la edad de oro del cine de Hollywood. Creo que fue lo primero que tradujeron de él aquí. La búsqueda de la felicidad se llama. Se fija especialmente en las comedias de los años 30, no en el cine social de esa época, que es la época de la Gran Depresión, sino en estas comedias populares y aparentemente escapistas, pero que sin embargo tienen, no sé, son muy avanzadas en el terreno de las costumbres y la moral. Con esas actrices maravillosas, fuertes, ¿no? De mucha personalidad, tan diferentes de unas de otras. Barbara Stanwyck, Katharine Hepburn. Yo diría que son las primeras actrices que llevan pantalones en las películas. Que también son películas, ¿no? Sobre la identidad femenina, ¿no? Sobre el coraje de llegar a ser uno mismo o de saber quién es uno realmente. Y todo eso lo relaciona con Emerson, que es uno de los padres de la filosofía norteamericana.
No me suena tampoco.
Pero bueno, lo importante son tus llaves. He hecho copias y funcionan.
Okay.
Pero tienes que tener cuidado con
I
esto.
have to stop here.
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you.
Also, I think I'm sorry because it's in Spanish and with French subtitles, but obviously, since you are all Cavalians, you understand Spanish and French, and you understand that, you know, this professor who is subletting his apartment, the hero, the star of the movie is telling her about Stanley's work, but also about the ethical transformation that we were talking about. So I wanted you to see these clips to show how strong and you know, the influence, Cavell's influence on movie making is.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Thank you very much, Juliet, and everyone here. It's been wonderful today. I just wanted to remind you, next session is the celebration of the celebration of Stanley's life on the 3rd anniversary of his death. We will have some sort of a preview of what is going to be the next book, the first posthumous workbook that's being edited by Nancy and Alice and Sandra. And we're also going to have a little clip, sort of a celebratory one. So I urge you to come and celebrate with us. And I think it's going to be very interesting, and invite friends that might be interested. Thank you for coming. Good to see you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, Sandra and Juliet.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
I have many questions for you, but
I know.
To be continued.
Yes.
You can write, and we'll be there next time.
Well, I've suggested we get together sometime in between so I'm going to send some dates and see if we can.
Let's try. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you, Victor.
Bye. Thank you all.
Au revoir.
So.